This is the Doc and Krueger cast, the official podcast of Doc and Krueger Games. Season 1, Episode 3, Character Creation and the Roll With It system. Hello friends, and welcome to episode 3 of the Doc and Krueger cast. I'm Chris Krueger, and I'm joined today by Adam Doc Bracken.
Hi everybody.
And today we're talking about making characters in the Roll With It system. So last episode we talked about creating your setting, how you come about that decision, and of course the setting plays a very big part in the characters you're going to make.
That is so true.
The rules describe the sort of mechanical process of making your character, but what we want to talk a little bit more is about the character concept you're going with, how that might influence the way you play your character going into the campaign, and then also how the mechanics of choosing how many cards you have, how many stars you have on those cards will affect the way that you're going to play, especially early in the game.
Yeah,
mechanically speaking.
Kind of a philosophy of character creation for this system. Yeah, Absolutely right.
So as far as coming up with the motifs for your motifs are, as we sort of said in the rule book, they can be pretty loosely defined, but essentially what it is, it's something you want to highlight about your character in the course of the story, because they're going to be coming up repeatedly. Whenever you open a scene, you're going to be playing one of your cards, and the motif on that card is going to play into what you're doing.
Yeah.
So Doc, you have an approach you like to use for kind of like 3 things to start with.
Yeah. Whenever you create the character from scratch, of course, in any system, no matter what it is, you're probably going to want to come up with like a sort of character concept first.
And sometimes that's as simple as I want to basically play this character that I've seen in some book or some movie or something
exactly.
like that.
And what I love to do is to take 2 characters and sort of mash them together. So it's easy to say, I'm going to make Indiana Jones. But if you say, I'm going to make Indiana Jones meets Harry Potter, what does that mean? You know what I'm saying? And in the right genre, that might be a lot of fun to have sort of a magical archaeologist or whatever. So that said, I like to come up with an object, a goal, and sort of a trait that defines the character. And so in my Indiana Jones example, the object, sort of the defining object for Indy might be his whip, right? And so I could literally just write down his whip. I actually had a character one time in earlier testing that one of his motifs was a walking stick. And so he used it as his weapon. He also used it as sort of a character-defining element for him because he was a guide. That was his job.
There's also, like to that point, there's kind of an iconography to the idea of a walking stick.
Yes.
Where either it implies old age or it implies something like, wilderness and survival. And,
right, exactly.
That sort of thing, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's broader than just its own self. It has, each motif individually is going to have its literal use, its sort of symbolic use as that character perceives it, and then maybe a grander, more call it symbolic use that others would see in it. A philosophical kind of, he's wise, therefore he has glasses. You know what I'm saying?
Or some sort of thematic thing that's built around the object.
Yeah, whatever it happens to be. So that's the first thing. I like an object. The second is a goal. And so this is a thing that motivates the character. And I just consider this to be good character writing, is whenever you have a character's goal and then you deny them the goal. It's almost like it's something for that character to abandon. And I'm not saying I set that up as a mechanical way to cheese it so that I can have an abandonment later. That's not the intent. But it may end up that the character needs to abandon that later, or they may need to physically break their walking stick. You know what I'm saying? It could be anything. But the idea of having something that the character wants and then denying them that or giving them the journey to that, that's interesting storytelling. I would say that that's the core of all plot, is to have it, to give a character a desire and then deny them the desire on some level, fundamentally. Even Bilbo the Hobbit wanted just peace and quiet and was denied that. And then that was the story hook for his little quest. And then he also really wanted adventure too, we discovered. So I guess you could argue he made an abandonment early, right?
Or maybe there's a little bit of a like a conscious desire versus an unconscious desire.
Well, he had a duality about him, and that was an interesting character. And so I guess I would say then for the third thing then, which is this idea of a trait, you could easily create things that are in conflict. I love home and garden, but I also have a spirit of adventure. And seeing how those two things interplay then as you create scenes and as you play out your character can be super interesting. I think there's a part in the rules that says that characters are complex and even contradictory. That's actually my favorite part of the rules, and you wrote it, and so I can't take credit. But it's, I think really critical when you're thinking about a character is to understand the depth and complexity of your character. Not in full, obviously.
Because some of that you're going to find out as you play.
You find out as you play, but you give some hooks, So yeah, it's great to say, I'm going to create a character that's Mulder from X-Files, but it's even more interesting to say, I'm going to create a character who is one part Mulder from X-Files and one part Hop from Stranger Things. Then what do you end up with? And I use that specific example because that's an example that was given to me by a player in a recent game. And I'm just like, oh, yes, that's good. Go with it. Talk with your GM. Talk with other players. See what's going on at the table. They might give you an idea of someone saying, yeah, I'm going to play a Mulder-ish character. Then I'll be your Scully. What does that mean?
Right. Yeah, that actually plays nicely into another point that I would make is that thinking about the role that your character is going to play in the story and in the party, as it were. If you want to think of it in kind of like a traditional D&D sense, for example, you need to make sure you've got your healer, you need to make sure you got your warrior, you got to have your rogue, that sort of thing. And if you are going with a story where you've got more kind of homogenous characters than you have characters that are different from each other, you got to find some other way to differentiate them. So say, for example, you're playing a campaign where you're all soldiers. Well, then what's your specialty? Or even if you're the same MOS, technically, what about your personalities makes you different? That sort of thing.
Yeah. Old war movies are cool because you've got the squad, and when you look at the squad, there's the different characters in that squad, and you can see the different personalities of, they're all brothers in arms, but they're different. And so that to me, I think is important. If you're going to create that kind of a setting, something that is, we're all in World War II, don't waste time with one of your objects being your submachine gun. It's assumed you have it. Right? You know what I'm saying?
Unless, for example, like, maybe you have a motif that you call "This is my rifle." Yes. Going back to like the Marines, for example. I'm not sure if anyone else does that. If it's the Army does that too, or whomever. But if your rifle means something to you, like maybe there's some sort of inner conflict over whether or not you want to use this.
Yeah.
Or maybe you're especially good with it, and that's one of your defining traits.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. And
name it. Name your rifle. It's more interesting to have Bertha on there in quotes and just like literally know that that's the name you gave your rifle.
Unless your character wouldn't give a name to a rifle and like maybe even make a point of that. Like maybe one of the motifs could be, and like this is something I would mention too, is that the way you write the motifs can be very open-ended.
Oh yeah.
Actually, sometimes the more open the way you name the motif, the better. So if it was something like you put in quotes, "I'm not naming my rifle."
Yeah, that could literally...
That's like a line the character might say, but it has so many other implications you could use.
So I personally love puns. And I think that a clever motif is going to be one that has more than one meaning.
For sure.
So suddenly I can't think of a single pun because I'm putting myself on the spot.
So here's an example, and it's not necessarily a pun, but I think it kind of plays into that same idea. This campaign that we're in the middle of right now at the time of recording, I'm a drift racer, and I'm taking a lot of inspirations from the anime Initial D. And so I've got a card on there that's called Deja Vu. Now this is a song essentially that was one of like the opening songs for the series. And it's a little bit of a meme, honestly, which is part of the reason I chose that one.
Oh yeah.
But also deja vu can mean what deja vu is. The sort of feeling of having been somewhere before, having a memory come to mind. So I've used it in different ways because deja vu can mean a lot of different things.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That actually reminds me, speaking of song titles, Jim in our season 4, which we used, of course, as the examples in the system, all of his and I mean literally all of them were song titles
From the 80s, yeah.
From the 80s, because that's who he was playing, was the 80s character. I think it was like the 2380s,
Yeah.
but it was the 80s nonetheless. And so yeah, he had songs like Bad, and that meant something. And we bring along all the baggage and the context of the song and the context and the movies that those are in and everything that goes along with it. Whenever you've got, I wear my sunglasses at night. And so every time he did a cool thing, he'd play that card. And it didn't mean he was literally wearing his sunglasses, though in that case, I think it did.
Yeah. He very, very rarely took them off.
He didn't, even in the dark world, but spoilers. But yeah, I think that if you can manage a pun like that, like rock solid, that could mean two things. That could mean I am a muscle, head, and I'm just like you. I'm so tough, but at the same time, it also means I'm not going to run.
You're reliable.
I've got courage. I'm rock solid, and so anything that's a double meaning like that, I think those are the best. To cite the exact same season 4, I was playing Leonardo. With my Italian accent, And what I did with that one was I actually referenced a lot of the Da Vinci Code.
Yeah, I got that. Yeah.
And So Dark the Con of Man, I think, was in there.
Draconian Devil.
Old Draconian Devil was in there. Yeah, which is a palindrome for
Leonardo da Vinci.
Leonardo, yeah, and so it's like or anagram rather. It was an anagram for Leonardo da Vinci, and so the having fun with that kind of a thing, I think, makes it really interesting. And then once the other players start getting used to your cards and what they are, you'll even hear them say, dude, you've totally got to buy in with, and then they'll tell you which of your aspects you're in. And you're like, but I had this great idea for the next scene. So I think when creating characters from the start, it's sort of finding that happy space, that happy place between, what's right for the setting, because it helps to inform the setting, but also is derived from the setting. And then also thinking in terms of, as we move forward in playing, what am I going to want this character to be doing? And so I think it's important then to also decide how many stars you're going to spend on what. Now, you have to buy at least 3 cards, but you have the option to buy 6.
Yeah, up to 6.
If you buy 6, you're going to have no star value on your cards, because that's the way it works. You spend a star to create a card, or add a star. And so, you could create 4 stars, or 4 cards, spend 4 stars on cards, but then you'd only have 2 left. And so you could have 1 card that had 2 star value and the rest would be 0, or you could spread it around so that you had 2 cards with 1 star. Or you could stick with the 3 cards that are mandatory and then decide to do like a 0, 1, 2, which is my personal preference.
Or a 1-1-1.
Or a 1-1-1.
Or an even 0-0-3.
Yeah, and then start with a card that's ready to be epiphanied out of the gate, which has weird mechanical feeling. If you're doing that, it's almost like you're James Bond, a one-note character who, at the very first scene or in the very first episode, does this thing that's so epic that it changes everything. And so I think, talk to me, Chris, about this idea of how the cards you choose from the beginning literally change the type of character you're creating, mechanically.
Yeah. And to be fair, technically the type of hand you have, whether it's like a very powerful small hand or whether it's a very weak large hand, doesn't necessarily translate to the type of character you're playing. However, it does have certain narrative implications. So, for example, if you start off with a very large hand with very few stars, you're going to have a lot of screen time early on, but you're probably going to be failing a lot.
Well, you'll be opening every scene if you take 6 and no one else does.
Now, that being said, that doesn't mean your character is necessarily incompetent. That means your character is just having a lot of challenges or things aren't going their way. And so you can either play that to comedic effect where like they're doing everything right, but things always go wrong, or it could be that there are things outside of their control that are making them fail, or maybe they're doing everything right, but they're making mistakes.
Suddenly you've created Walter Mitty from the Ben Stiller movie recently. I loved that film. I thought it was great.
Whereas if you have a smaller, more powerful hand, you're going to have less screen time comparatively.
Yes.
But you could enter a scene and be, again, competent's not the right word, but you can have a chance of winning the scene. Having a 2-star card, and if you play that early, and if you especially lose a scene early, playing a 2-star card always comes with the risk of it, if you want to call it a risk, of it becoming a 3-star card. And because you can only have one 3-star card in the game, that's going to be the one that you either have to abandon or epiphany before you can have another 3-star card, which means chances are you're going to be using it a lot and using it in very sort of strategically appropriate situations, which we'll talk about in another episode. But your character, whenever that card comes up, is going to have a lot of narrative influence. They're going to be able to have things go their way. So if you want to think of it this way, the higher the star value on your cards, the more you'll be able to control as a player where your story is going. Your character will want something and they'll be able to get it because your cards are powerful enough to get that for you.
As relates to that aspect specific, or rather motif specifically.
But then again, going back to the lots of cards with fewer stars, like say you start off with 6 0 value cards. You're going to be growing a lot of them very quickly. You're going to be on screen a lot because you're very often going to be the one with the most cards, so you get to open a lot of scenes. Yeah. So in a sense, the story is almost going to become about your character.
Yeah. High presence stat, to use a metaphor from other systems.
Maybe. Your presence might actually be really terrible in that regard, but
that's a good point.
Screen presence and your presence in kind of a charismatic sense are two very different things. Yeah. And again,
you'll be Napoleon Dynamite.
you could be playing an extremely charismatic and really charismatic character who's really good with people, who most of the time could be expected to succeed in scenes where they're being social, essentially.
That's a good way to put it.
And yet, because you've got a lot of really weak cards, you'll be running into a lot of situations where even though you're doing all the right things, maybe this is like you're dealing with a society that's not quite into what you know, or maybe you are just like running up against people who don't like you and who don't want to be swayed by what you're doing, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of different ways you can sort of explain it narratively.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whatever approach you take. But that is something to keep in mind, is that more cards equals more screen time. More powerful cards means more control.
Yeah.
And eventually you get to a point where you have a lot of cards and a lot of power, but you can also get maxed out eventually, which is another topic again for another time.
Yeah. Well, even Bruce Willis, who was completely epic in Die Hard, was having a really bad day when you think about it.
Yeah. And so another note I kind of wanted to make as we start to wind things down, as far as coming up with your motifs, you used the approach of having an object, a goal, and a trait. But that isn't by any means a requirement. And in fact, if you got any more than 3 cards, then you've already got one that you have to kind of just decide what to do with. If you're more visually driven, just as a person, as a player, as a storyteller, you might come up with a lot of things that you can see and use tangibly that then have different sort of narrative interpretations as you go through it. On the other hand, you might be someone who's more interested in a theme, and so you don't want to be restricted to like, oh, I don't want to have to keep like playing my stick every time. But you want to sort of explore themes of, let's say like maybe tolerance is a theme of the story you're telling. And so whenever you open a scene with tolerance, it's either to highlight a moment of intolerance or of tolerance and kind of exploring that theme. And the way that you explore it can be different every time you play it. So it really just comes down to what your sort of sense is as a storyteller. Yeah. And that's another reason actually that starting with a smaller hand is sometimes a good idea. We recommend, if you're a new player, starting with a smaller hand.
Yes.
Because part of it is that as you go into a story, you're not really going to know exactly how it's going to shape up. And so being able to create a new card at some point to react to like, okay, so the story's going in a direction I didn't necessarily expect. I want to be able to have a card that's addressing the sort of stuff that we're seeing.
Yes.
Having room to do that is always a good idea.
So, you could think in terms of maybe you wanted a character who was an actor, right? And that actor won an Academy Award. So one of your things is Academy Award, because that's a big deal to the character. But it turns out that this is actually a really dark, gritty noir. And so in one of the first scenes, what happens is someone gets bludgeoned to death with your award. And so for the rest of the time, you literally have the murder weapon. And so it means a different thing to you. And so be willing to let these motifs evolve is really what I'm going for there. With a nice bloody example. And it's the idea of, this could be the thing that you love. It's your car, it's your whatever, but then it becomes this sort of pariah. Or maybe the other way around. Maybe it's a thing that is the thorn in your side, but then you grow to love it. You use it. anyway, think openly about that.
And we'll get a little bit more into how to develop your character over time in a future episode on character growth.
Yep.
But for now, that is about all we had to say on the best practices for character creation. So if we kind of want to say in summary, get creative with your motifs. Again, talk to your GM and to your group, see kind of where you can fit in, like where's sort of the gap in either the roles narratively or the roles sort of practically in the party that can kind of like help you bring something that no one else is bringing. Because when you have a good variety in the group, you get a much richer story. People can sort of play off each other, and that's always a lot of fun.
Absolutely right.
And then, of course, again, think about your, in the mechanical sense, think about how many cards you open with, how many stars are on those cards, as that's going to greatly affect, at least early in the game, how it is that you're going to be experiencing the story.
Yep. If you see yourself as a support character, then, make sure you've got few cards, but they're nicely powered up, and you'll be very happy with that.
Thank you for joining us for Season 1, Episode 3 of the Doc and Krueger cast, our discussion on character creation in the Roll-It system. I'm Chris.
I'm Doc.
And we'll see you next time. The Doc and Krueger cast is a production of Doc and Krueger Games, jointly hosted by Adam Doc Bracken and Chris Krueger. The theme music was composed by Nick Krueger. The Roll-It system is available now. You can find it and our other games through our website, docandkrueger.com.